Here in upstate New York, life moves a little differently. Out here on our 350-acre property, every day brings a new story. My wife Dani and I, we've built a home, not just for us, but for over 300 souls who needed a second chance. This is their sanctuary. We're Mark and Dani Longo, and this isn't just a farm. It's Peanuts Freedom Farm, a place where every animal writes a new chapter. So join us as we share the laughs, the challenges, and the incredible journey of life on the farm. Welcome to Peanuts Freedom Farm. The following is part one of a conversation with Mark Longo regarding the events that happened on October 30th, 2024, when New York State authorities raided his home and seized his beloved animals, Peanut and Fred.
So the way I've been trying to cope with this whole tragedy has been trying to spend more time in Peanut's room. For 7.5 years I've had Peanut, and he was never caged. He's always had a cage in his room, but it was always a 24/7 opened cage. You know, squirrels are a unique creature, right? They shouldn't be caged up. They need, 24/7 attention. They need to get that energy out. It's like every animal, they don't deserve to spend their life in a cage. So Peanut always had his own room. And, we built angled shelves for him and stuff so he could be that master of parkour that he always was. So after this, entire ordeal happened, I asked the world to send their favorite memories of Peanut, because I got to live the memories and I wanted everybody else's memories in here. So we made Peanut's room a memorial type of setting for Peanut and Fred, and you're looking at all of the, a portion of, the items that we've gotten from people from around the world. Obviously we ran out of room for a lot of it, but we have boxes and boxes and boxes of memorial stuff that people have sent from around the world, from kids to grandma and grandpas. Like, you had everybody take time out of their day and go and, paint a photo or, write a letter or, build something. You have wooden sculptures of Peanut and Fred. You have paintings. You have, portraits. You have collages. You have ornaments. You have everything in here. And it just goes to show how important Peanut and Fred were to the world. The government overreach in this particular story was heinous. It was uncalled for. It was disgusting. And I believe that because of this story making worldwide news, it made a lot of people put a lot of questions in perspective. Is the supposed government who works for us can just easily come into your house whenever they see fit and throw accusations your way. And Nick, I showed you the article today. There's an alligator that is somehow was housed in New York State, was not killed when he was taken. He was actually shipped over to Texas to a rehab facility. And now the gentleman who owned the alligator is getting the opportunity to get the application looked at by the DEC to return the alligator to New York State. Yet my squirrel, Peanut the squirrel, was such a detriment to society that he needed to be killed. He needed to be taken out. He needed, and where was my call to the court? Where was my opportunity to get the application done? Right. Where was my due process? But we're talking about a fluffy tree rat and an alligator. Yeah. It's not like there was a dog that bit somebody and it was, protecting its household or protecting its human, and they're fighting for this dog's life. This is an alligator. You don't get bit by an alligator and walk away from that. You're missing something after that. There's a difference. You can get bit by a dog and walk away with it. You can't get bit by an alligator and look at your arm and go, a couple of Band-Aids and I'll be okay tomorrow.
I don't know about you, but I've never seen an alligator in the wild here in New York.
Right. Hey, there you go. You don't see one in the wild, let alone in somebody's household, And you're going to tell me that this alligator was, I don't know the full, facts of the story, but this is an older alligator. I believe it's in its 20s. And this gentleman has had him for, don't get me wrong, like bond with an animal, that's fine. But you didn't come here and find a rhinoceros in the house. You know, an alligator can eat somebody. A squirrel cannot eat you. Well, not only that, you take it to social media, who's everybody who has been trashing me for not having the application or not having this set paperwork for a squirrel. Now, this gentleman looks like he didn't have it, or he was going through the application, which what I was doing. And let's take a poll. What's more dangerous, a squirrel or an alligator? Okay, and if there is one person that says a squirrel is more dangerous than an alligator, then the problem isn't in the animals, it's in the human beings that are, taking this into consideration. But, it just shows the blatant target on me and my family. You, again, don't know the extenses of the case, but even if you did raid the house, which would probably be worthy of a search warrant with an alligator, you take the alligator out of there and you don't kill it. You don't immediately kill it. Somebody had to pay for that alligator to be shipped to Texas, right? Who paid for that? Who's paying for it to come back? If it's for the owner, that's fine. But also the ability to have that option was not there for me. The ability to speak my mind was not there. How do you now justify asking my wife for immigration status when you're about to give, there's a potential possibility that this gentleman gets his alligator back? Like, this is the conversation we're having, Nick,
Yeah, it's
it's not some story. This is not some made up, script. You're literally sitting in the room of the world's most famous squirrel and a raccoon who needed a little bit of extra help in life. And we're actually having a comparison conversation to a family who had an alligator. And you know who lost in this? The person with the squirrel. So if you're going to play the law is the law, then how come the laws were written the same, but also enforced in two different ways with, again, let's be honest. An alligator bites your foot. There's a good chance you don't have a toe. There's a good chance you need surgery. There's a good chance there's a bone broken. You get bit by a squirrel, you're bleeding and gonna need a Band-Aid. My thought process is like, you're not talking about another squirrel.
Right.
You're not talking about a friendly, happy animal that everybody can come and hang out with. There's an A and there's a Z, and there's not a comparable.
Sure.
The only thing you compare here is they're two animals. Cool.
Yeah.
Wonderful. But, and not to throw anybody under the bus, do you think I was the only person that had a squirrel in the New York State, that had a famous pet squirrel in the New York State? I could count a handful on my hands without saying their names. But if you're going to target me, how come you didn't target the other squirrels that were living in this state for the last 5 to 7 years? You knew that they were there. You knew the social media. They say, found in New York. There, commercials done, big articles done about other squirrels, other animals that are quote unquote illegal to have, but yet nothing was spoken about, But then I get hit with, oh, you had 7 years to get the application. Well, I lived in a different state, for starters. And also, if you're going to point the finger and call a spade, how come nobody was saying this to the other squirrel? Nobody's saying this to the alligator. I don't see a march on social media going, oh, this guy shouldn't have his alligator returned. Like, is this what we're having this conversation about? Nick, it literally feels like a fantasy that we're having a conversation about the killing of a small rat, which the only kind of, you could have a flying squirrel, but you can't have a squirrel. The guy owned the house. The guy allowed me to live here. It was Peanuts World, and we just lived in it. You don't see many people who can dedicate a room to a squirrel. At the end of the day, I don't say that with ignorance to go, oh, yeah, I got this big house, blah, blah. No, it's like, my wife and I don't have kids. We had a spare room, and we dedicated it to Peanut. And when I found Peanut, I was single. I had a spare room in my previous house. I didn't want him to be in a cage, so I gave him a room. And I've always gotten like, my kids don't even have a room, or, I didn't have a room that size growing up, or, I don't even have that big of a room now. But Peanut did. Peanut had full range of the house, and to be able to tell the story, waking up and eating breakfast with him, brushing my teeth with him on my shoulder, taking a shower and he's just sitting there running around in the bathroom waiting for me to get out. It was a feel-good, like, litter box trained, dressed up, you hold signs, like, all this stuff I never taught him. The litter box I taught him, but the stuff that everybody saw wasn't teachable moments. I'm not a squirrel whisperer, it was just like, this worked, this didn't work, he doesn't want to do this, there was days when Peanut didn't want to dress up, he didn't want to hold a sign, but there were days that he couldn't get enough of it. So we played on this kind of stubborn Italian character for Peanut because that's how I was. Like, did I want to go play hockey on Monday? Sure. But when Tuesday came and I didn't want to play hockey, I didn't want to play hockey, But it was like, you had the same kind of physical and mental, you could make up this storyline of Peanut. But he was everybody's superstar. Having people travel the world to meet this squirrel. Like, as crazy and as weird as that sounds, like, that's one of the most honorable things about my life with Peanut was the amount of people that would travel 5 hours, would take their kid out of school, travel a full day to come to New York to meet Peanut. Have a 92-year-old want her birthday with Peanut. It's like you have somebody travel from England to go to New York City, but her pit stop is to come meet Peanut. You have all of these people that fell in love with him, whether or not they got to physically meet him or not, but we have countless videos of families coming, kids coming, young adults, grandma and grandpas, people in wheelchairs, and, Mike, comparing that to an alligator, you can't have, somebody come in and be like, here, let me put this alligator on your lap. Oh, by the way, don't touch its face, or if it turns, run, because it's going to bite your face off. So it's like one extreme to another, but then it makes you think, how much was this really about Peanut and how much was it about me and my family moving here? You can come up with a bunch of different stories, but, it's with articles and information that you see like this where it's like, I feel for you because you have a bond and you want that bond back. Nobody wants to get their family members taken away. But again, like we all say, there's no comparison between an alligator and a squirrel. You have one that literally has virtually no threat to you whatsoever, and one that could literally end your life in 2 seconds. That's the answer that the world is looking for is why? What made Peanut FBI's #1? What made Peanut allow a judge to sign a criminal search warrant? What made Peanut have 4 agencies get involved with killing him? What was so detrimental to having him that you couldn't just lead us in the right direction of what we actually needed to get? Like I said in the beginning, and since this whole nonprofit started, we have been working with the state to comply with literally everything. Department of Agriculture has come out multiple times. They've done inspections here. They've praised my wife for the extra testing she does for her goats. He's come down here probably 3 or 4 times, and even when he did find an error, he gave us the list of things that we needed to do to complete the paperwork to the error. And, for example, like we want to start an adoption program here, but there's paperwork that you need to do in order to adopt animals out. If he hadn't told me that, I would have just adopted animals out. But at the end of the day, it's some paperwork, it's a minor fee, and there's nothing really to it. It's the government getting a little bit of money for you for getting, the ability to have a license for 3 years to adopt animals out. Because we're not even selling them. Mm-hmm. We adopt them out. So, it was crazy to see the people that actually truly wanted to see this place succeed. And then you see on the flip side the people that wanted us to fail in the most abrupt and ludicrous way. And you found that by killing the animal that literally started the nonprofit. No, that's what the craziest part is we understood that Peanut's millions of social media followers were not mine. There's a handful of people that enjoy me being in the background, but if I was the main character here, it wouldn't even be 10 followers. It would be, much less. So we understood that, having such a big follower for Peanut could help us start something bigger than all of us, and we always kind of understood that Peanut's it's a rescue animal. He's not a pet. He came from a dangerous situation, which we were allowed to be the voice to help him get out of that situation, and we did whatever it took to get him back into his natural habitat. It just didn't work. He was injured, and if we put him back outside, regardless of how old he was, I truly don't think he would have made it that long. So it's 7 years later of doing this social media thing, really just using it as like a feel-good story. Never like, oh, we got to monetize this, we got to do this, we got to do that. And, in hindsight, we were just like, you know what? Fast hustle and bustle style of city life, it's getting old. I'm getting older. The stress levels of working in New York City is just, it's something, if you don't live in a big city, you can't really experience it. But, we a year prior to starting this organization, started talking about a business plan, finding a property, how we're going to fund it, all the whole 9 yards, and doing it for a legacy for Peanut. That was the whole reason why we started this. You have dreams, obviously. Everybody wants to be the MVP quarterback in the Super Bowl. In hindsight, you're going to get there. Odds are probably not. So that kind of was my goal, was to have an organization, built around saving animals. But it's always a pipe dream. Like, you need to get a 9 to 5. You need to, provide for your family, or, whatever you're doing in life. And, you're hoping one day you could save enough, or you hit the lottery, or you come into something financially stable that you're able to do something like this. And we just had the opportunity to do it. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that what goes into this is it's not just a one-time payment. You get an animal, it's just good. You put him out, he eats grass, he's happy, the blah, 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 blah. You see it firsthand. You got to battle the climate. You have to battle the weather. You have to, when a hose freezes, you got to find a way. You need to get another, hose. You need to make sure everybody is outside living a good life. Proper supplements, proper maintenance, proper food. Especially bringing in animals that are neglected. They're 400 pounds underweight, so it's $15,000 to $30,000 a month. And that's like not with some catastrophic vet care, or bringing in a new animal, or, so on, as tractor breaks down, so on and so forth. So, we really had to sit down and really think about how we were going to do this. And our main focus was, we have eyes of millions of people with Peanut. If we start an organization backed by Peanut, and it could fulfill a legacy of Peanut by helping other animals, this might be the opportunity we have. And so, obviously we can go down a different path of how I obtained the amount of money to get here, and that's just a story for another day, but we did whatever it took to get to the position that we were able to start this organization. I don't think there would have been an opportunity for me to hone in on a specific, amount of people, get people to trust what we're doing here. I think the family aspect of Peanut's page really grew people to think of us more or less like influencers, and more of like a part of their family. Noontime on your lunch break, what are you doing? You're following Peanut around on his live. Your break time, you're following me around the farm with all the animals that we're rescuing because of Peanut. So it was like, oh, okay, tune in on Wednesday to watch Peanut wear his cowboy hat and eat a waffle. And then Thursday, let's go check out the new, ducks that we just took in, or, the 4 rescue horses from the slaughter auction. So 12 o'clock became really important to a lot of people, because you got to come in and forget about the world for a second, enjoy the life of a unique character in a squirrel. And you didn't know if he was going to be happy one day, he was going to be grumpy, he was going to be cuddly, throw a tantrum. You didn't really know the attitude you're going to get from Peanut. And it just made it for, something really fun. Was it kind of like repetitive? Sure, but the repetitiveness was being in this room. The repetitiveness wasn't his personality. It was something to do every day. And we just captured that, and we wanted to capture, the fun stuff, but also change that into helping more animals. Well, it was a surreal moment. Like, even today while we're talking about this, it doesn't feel like we're actually doing this. It feels like a script out of a movie that's just a bad nightmare. But you kick the legs out of an organization that does whatever it takes to help more animals. When the state came, they treated me like the biggest criminal on the planet. The state came and refused to allow me to feed the horses that we've taken from bad situations, who missed breakfast and lunch. When you deal with these neglected cases, these animals can't afford to miss any more meals than they already did. And then you come in here and you inspect a toilet before I go to the bathroom, and you decide that my wife's immigration status is somehow tied into Peanut the squirrel, and you falsely detain us for 5 hours because, it takes 5 hours to pick up a squirrel and a raccoon. I understand the safety and the lives of people, who have to go and, fight criminals and uphold the law. But if you're telling me that you needed 9 people and 6 with guns to come and take my squirrel and my raccoon from a rescue nonprofit, I was going to throw a lot of questions in the air as to what you were really here for. Did you bring that type of manpower when you were picking up this alligator? What kind of was so different in this 10-month investigation that, unfortunately ended up the way it ended up? But you came in here with a purpose, and, this is my biased opinion, but you came here with a purpose to shut this place down. Because, you claim rabies on an animal that in your own database provides you the information that squirrels have never transmitted rabies ever in the history of the United States. But all of a sudden you take the world's most famous squirrel from a nonprofit animal rescue that is named after the squirrel, and then you deem him that he has the potential to have rabies because of quote-unquote bite. That we're still waiting to have evidence of a bite. So, at this point, 4 months later, what can you provide the world that you couldn't provide the world on day 2? Being a person that's never been on the opposite side of the law before really changed the way you perceive, the people, and it's unfortunately, it truly, and I never understood it before this happened, where that 1% of people put in positions of power really ruin it for the rest of the 99 that go out there and fight those bullets and fight those drug addicts who, could strip your life away in a heartbeat. You're out there really fighting a good fight for people who came to this country or live the freedoms that they get to live because you're out there fighting the bad stuff. Yeah. So when you hear a 10-month investigation, you hear the fact that these agencies were preparing to kill the animals before the raid even happens. You hear and you get, confirmation from neighbors who said they saw these agencies drive by multiple times in the week prior taking photos of the farm. Does that sound like you're coming here for a squirrel and a raccoon? You're not. You don't do that much surveillance for a crack house, and if you do, why are you comparing a squirrel and a raccoon to a meth lab? What were your true intentions here? And I could promise you it has a lot more to do with something else. Why did it take 9 people to come here? Again, I don't know rules and procedures, but I can understand the fact that no state is looking to pay 6 figures to bring 9 agents to a farm in the middle of nowhere to kill a squirrel and a raccoon. And you play it out as a 10-month series of things. I don't care about the complaints. As the opposite side of the law, how many times do I have to call on you, Nick, before you get your house raided? Is it one time? Is it like, it's like getting to the center of a Tootsie Pop? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 15? Do I have to make up a story? Do I have to follow you? Do I have to, scope into your personal life? Do I have to find your the one thing you did back in when you were 18 to go, oh, look how terrible this person is. We need to go rescue these animals. If you were told that I was running an illegal wildlife rehabilitation clinic, how hard is it to drive by, come up here and observe what you're looking at? No, I can't. I truly can't sit down and give you a logical answer as to going, this was 100% for Peanut and Fred. There's nothing. And even if I had the kickback to say, F you, state of New York, I'm not getting that application done, I'm not doing this, I still don't see this opportunity to raid somebody's house and take away these happy, loving. Again, if you were here because the animals were being neglected, okay, I have an understanding of it. But if you try to play a neglect case now, how come you didn't take any of the 400 animals that we have here? How come you didn't take the bunny that was housed with Fred? If we were claiming rabies and you were so, rabies gung-ho, how come you didn't take any of the other animals? it's like we always say, it's 2 steps forward, 7 back. You know, you finish a fence over here, you go start to fix this other one, you come back and the first one's broken. So, you know, it's and you do it for free. You know, and people are like, well, where's this money? It's all IRS audited. Yeah. You know, it's not like I can just go, oh, Nick, you know, we'll take a little bit off the top over here. You gotta, to the penny, show the IRS where your donations and your money are coming from. And it's also public information. If you looked up the organization, you'd see people's salaries, you'd see who's actually getting paid from the organization and the board members, who's running it, so on and so forth. But, you know, that's public information. You can't hide that. We just want to run a facility that is doing very good for the animals. It's doing good for the community because the bond between people and animals can be very, very positive. And build this place for a community that truly needs something like this. You know, you live in the middle of nowhere. There's not many things to do. A lot of things involve horses and livestock and farms. You know, why not start a place where kids and families can come and feed horses that just need some extra love, you know, and you come here and there's never, you know, since you've been here, I've never been like, Nick, listen, don't go buy Nibbles. He's a little bit skittish. You don't know if he's going to make like a false move and hit you or something like that. There's nobody here that I have to be like, okay, you know, just shy away from this field or whatever. You have just happy, loving animals that needed a voice. And you know, you go outside again, like, you don't see a single horse where you can go, oh, we could sell that one for $1 million. Like, I'd have to pay you to take some of these animals. And I love them to death. And, you know, that's why we're here, is to make sure that they live the happiest life. And I'll take all of the punches. I don't care if you call me a scam artist or you want where the receipts are, blah, blah, blah. It's all taken care of instantly when they left. You know, I got onto social media and told everybody. And that was the explosion of this story, was that one, hey guys, the government just raided my house and took Peanut. Please, here is a number, find where Peanut is. Let's save Peanut. And it just, I have 30, 40, 50 million followers, petitions at 100,000, you know, signatures. Where is this animal? And unbeknownst to us, he's already dead, you know. So you're going 3 days of TMZ calling you, Chris Cuomo, Fox News, CNN, you know, every single major news outlet going, what just happened? What the just happened in your life? What did you do? Like, were you cooking meth? Were you trafficking children? Did you have an arsenal of bazookas? Were you, you know, what were you doing that was so heinous that it provided a 10-month investigation with 9 trucks coming up your driveway to seize what you would think is a very big, you know, pounds of cocaine or, you know, 1 million meth rocks or whatever you want. And now you go out and tell this. Did you just say they came to your house and raided your house for a squirrel? Yeah. You know, and then boom, you have Vice President Vance, and you have Elon Musk, and you have President Trump, and you have the National Policing Association, you have the Supreme Court Justice come out and say something, you have multiple celebrities, you have people from around the world calling your phone. Where is Peanut the squirrel? What happened to Peanut the squirrel? And then you have your government, who you pay taxes to, can't even call you up with an update, but have the balls to call the local news to tell them that you killed the animals. And that's 3 days later. And what you did prior to that was you went out and you commented prior to telling the world that you killed these animals, and you told the press that you couldn't tell the world whether or not Peanut was alive or dead. And right then and there, I understood what they did, because anybody with their right mind could have just went out and said, Peanut's fine. We're running tests to make sure he's okay. He's going to a rehab facility. We don't know if we're going to be able to return him or not. You go and read this alligator story. I don't see any times where you were, you know, telling this alligator family, if they don't leave their house right now, there's going to be bigger problems. You know, I didn't see anything of the lines where they just focused on one portion of the house. You know, again, I'm very limited with the amount of facts that I have with this, but I'm going to assume that they didn't target their bedroom. I'm going to assume that they took apart other parts of their house instead of just the 2 closets in there. Because, Nick, you've been to this farm a couple times now. Yeah. Not a single closet where you stayed in this house was touched. Yeah. Not a single drawer was opened. And we've all watched cops. We've all watched raids. We've all watched this stuff. These cops don't put your shit back. They don't put any of your stuff back. If it's on the ground, it stays on the ground. You're obligated to put your own stuff back. So don't tell me you came here for a squirrel and a raccoon and focused on one portion of the house. And just so happens to be my portion of the house. So, again, we could sit here and debate what the true reasoning is for this to have occurred, but we really just don't know until we get the facts. But the world saw this. The amount of public and world leaders who saw this and supported us and are disgusted by the government overreach was an honor. And I know a lot of people go, oh, you must be politically driven, or it's this, and like, I'm the least political guy, and I've said this since day one. Color didn't do this, people did this. And I don't give a shit what people have to say about it. I don't care if you're a blue or a red or a green, I don't care. People had to come into a room and have a meeting and say, we gotta go kill this squirrel. At the end of the day, that has nothing to do with your background and everything to do with your character as a person. And what the saddest reality for me is the gentlemen, the two officers that were sitting with me and my wife who were detained, were the nicest two people that I have met in a while. But the simple fact of the matter is you knew exactly what was going to happen before you got here and after you got here. So you sat there and you put a smile on my face because you were being nice, but you full-hearted knowing that once you left here, you were killing those animals. So in my eyes, that's even worse than the motherfucker who led this investigation, because you sat there and you made people feel comfortable, full-hearted knowingly you were going to kill their family members. And these people need to be held accountable for that.